July 16, 1945, New Mexico desert. The clock strikes 5:30 in the morning when the first artificial sun in human history illuminates the horizon. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, watches the fireball rise into the heavens. In that moment, as the world entered the nuclear age, Oppenheimer's mind did not go to a mathematical equation or a principle of modern physics. It traveled 5,000 years back in time. He whispered to himself a line from an ancient Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Most people know this quote. It is famous. What most people don't know is what happened years later, when Oppenheimer was giving a lecture at a university. A student raised his hand and asked a simple yet loaded question. He asked, "Dr. Oppenheimer, was the Alamogordo test the first time an atomic bomb was detonated?" Oppenheimer paused, looked at the student, and replied with surgical care, "Yes, in modern times." What did he know? Why would a man of science, rooted in quantum physics, make such a specific distinction between modern times and the remote past? The answer may not be in history books, but it is scattered literally beneath our feet in the sands of the world's oldest deserts. If you travel today to the Great Sand Sea, on the border between Libya and Egypt, you will find something that defies conventional geology. Scattered across miles and miles of dunes, there are pieces of a yellow-green, translucent, and incredibly pure glass. Science calls this Libyan Desert glass. It is beautiful. The ancient Egyptians used it in their jewelry. In fact, the central scarab in the pectoral of Pharaoh Tutankhamun was carved from this glass. But here is the problem. To transform pure silica sand into this type of glass, you need to raise the temperature to over 1800 degrees Celsius. And you need to do it instantly and then cool it rapidly. There is no gentle natural geological process that does this. Volcanoes do not produce this type of glass. Ancient campfires or ceramic kilns barely reach 1,000 degrees. The official explanation, the safe explanation, is that a meteor exploded in the atmosphere or impacted the sand. But a meteor impact leaves a crater. It leaves specific chemical debris. It leaves chaos. In the Libyan desert, there is no crater. What exists are sheets of melted glass covering an immense area, as if the sky itself had scorched the ground. Curiously, there is only one other place on Earth where we find exactly the same type of green glass formation: the Trinity test site in New Mexico, where Oppenheimer detonated his bomb. There, the sand melted by the nuclear explosion is called trinitite. Trinitite and Libyan desert glass are, for all practical purposes, geological cousins. The only difference is that one was created in 1945 and the other was created thousands of years ago, in a time when, according to history books, humanity barely knew how to work with copper. But the physical evidence gets even more disturbing when we leave the desert and go to the cities. In modern-day Pakistan, in the Indus Valley, there is an archaeological site called Mohenjo Daro. It was a metropolis of antiquity, with plumbing, urban planning, and inexplicable sophistication. But the name Mohenjo Daro is not the city's original name. We don't know what they called themselves. Mohenjo Daro is a modern name that literally means the mound of the dead. When archaeologists began excavating the deeper layers of the city in the 1920s, they found a scene of horror frozen in time. Skeletons, not in graves, not in a cemetery, but scattered in the streets. Men, women, and children fallen where they stood, face down on the ground. Some were holding hands. There are no signs of sword strikes, no arrowheads, no bodies of invading warriors looting the city. Whatever killed those people killed everyone instantly, without warning. They simply dropped dead while walking. And here enters the data that conventional archaeology tries to ignore. Decades later, Soviet and Western scientists measured radioactivity in these skeletons. In some cases, the levels were 50 times higher than natural background radiation. They were levels comparable to those found in the bodies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The city walls show signs of vitrification. Clay bricks melted and fused together by heat so intense it turned the clay into glass, a heat of thousands of degrees. It wasn't a common fire. Fires burn upwards. This energy came from top to bottom, vitrifying the city and vaporizing its inhabitants. If we look only at the stones and the bones, the logical conclusion is terrifying. An advanced civilization was wiped off the map by a weapon of mass destruction thousands of years before we supposedly invented gunpowder. Oppenheimer knew, and ancient texts, those we call mythology, don't just confirm this. They describe the explosion, the mushroom cloud, and even radiation sickness with a clinical precision that is impossible to ignore. If vitrified sand and radioactive skeletons are the crime scene, then ancient texts are the eyewitness testimonies, and these witnesses, separated by thousands of miles and different cultures, describe the same thing: a blinding light, a consuming fire, and an invisible sickness that kills those who survive the blast. Let's start with India. The Mahabharata is not just a religious book or a collection of myths. It is a detailed historical chronicle, and within its hundreds of thousands of verses we find the description of a battle that sounds hauntingly modern. The text speaks of the weapon of Brahma, or the iron thunderbolt. Listen to the description and ask yourself if this sounds like arrows and spears. The text says, Gurkha, flying in his swift and powerful Vimana, hurled against the three cities a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 1,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. The brightness was so intense it was impossible to look directly at it, but what happens after the explosion is what truly freezes the blood. The Mahabharata describes that after the attack, terrible winds began to blow. Nature went mad. The sun seemed to spin in the sky. The water in the rivers boiled, killing the fish, and then came the effects on people. The text reports that warriors who survived threw themselves into rivers to wash their weapons and their bodies, as if trying to decontaminate themselves from something invisible. Days later, people began to lose their hair and nails. Birds turned white and fell from the sky. Food became poisoned. For thousands of years, historians read this and thought, what a creative metaphor for the wrath of the gods. But we who live in the post-1945 world know exactly what these symptoms are: hair loss, nail loss, skin burned without fire. This is acute radiation poisoning. There is no other weapon in the ancient world, not Greek fire, not gunpowder, that causes these specific biological effects. Whoever wrote the Mahabharata saw a nuclear detonation, or something very similar. Now, let's travel from India to the Middle East, to one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The version we are told in Sunday school is about sin and divine punishment. But when we apply the work of translators like Mauro Biglino, who analyzes the original Hebrew without the filter of theology, the story changes completely. Biglino points out that the angels who visit Lot are not spiritual beings with wings. The text calls them men or messengers. They eat, they drink, they get tired, and they need to wash their feet. And their mission isn't magic, it's tactical. They have military intelligence. They know the city will be destroyed and need to evacuate Lot and his family before 0 hour. The warning they give is extremely specific. They say, "Flee for your lives. Do not look back and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be consumed." Why flee to the mountains? In a flood, you go up. In a fire, you run upwind. But in a nuclear explosion, the shockwave and heat travel in a straight line across the plain. The mountains offer the only physical protection, a shield against thermal radiation and the pressure wave. And then we have the most disturbing detail: Lot's wife. The Bible says she looked back and became a pillar of salt. The Hebrew word used there can refer to vapor or powder. If you are close enough to an atomic explosion and look directly at the flash, the thermal radiation vaporizes the water in your body instantly. What remains is a calcified form, minerals and carbon. It isn't divine magic turning someone into table seasoning. It is a brutal physical description of someone being caught by the heat wave of a weapon of mass destruction. Abraham, watching from afar, describes what he saw the next morning. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. Again, the mushroom cloud, the smoke that rises like a column. Both in India and in Israel, the descriptions match. Light stronger than the sun, winds that knock everything down, heat that vaporizes, invisible sicknesses. If it were just an isolated account, we could doubt it. But when civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other describe the same apocalyptic technology, we have to stop calling it myth and start calling it memory. But if there were nuclear bombs, who dropped them? And, more importantly, how did they transport them? This is where we enter the forbidden technology of the gods. If we accept the physical evidence that weapons of mass destruction were used in the past, an inevitable logistical question arises. How were they delivered? If you have a nuclear bomb, you need a bomber or a missile. You need air superiority. And this is exactly where the story gets strange, because ancient texts don't just talk about explosions, they speak in exhaustive detail about the flying machines that controlled the skies. In India, these vehicles have a name, Vimanas. The Sanskrit word today simply means airplane or temple, but in ancient Vedic texts, a Vimana was a very specific machine. They weren't magic carpets, they were ships built with metals we barely know, described as being made of dark iron or bright gold. The Vaimanika Shastra, a text that claims to compile ancient knowledge about aeronautics, goes further. It doesn't just tell stories of heroes. It reads like a technical manual. It describes types of propulsion based on heated mercury, gyroscopes for stability, and even evasive maneuvers to escape enemy ships. Why would a Bronze Age storyteller invent the concept of invisible camouflage or the idea of using mirrors to reflect light and blind enemy sensors? Unless he was describing something he saw. The text says Vimanas could hover in the air, fly into outer space, and even dive underwater. This is what we call today a transmedium vehicle, something the United States Navy admits, in its recent UFO reports, is the technological signature of non-human craft. But if you think India is an isolated case, look at the Bible. Perhaps the most technical and disturbing description of a spaceship in antiquity is in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel wasn't a soldier, he was a priest. He didn't have the vocabulary to describe polished metal, thrusters, or landing gear. So he used what he knew. He says, "I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal." He describes beings coming out of this structure, but what stands out is the machine itself. He talks about a wheel within a wheel, which could move in any direction without turning. This is the perfect description of a gyroscope or an omnidirectional landing system. For centuries, theologians said this was a mystical vision of God's glory. But in the 1970s, a senior NASA engineer named Joseph Blumrich decided to prove Erich von Däniken wrong. Blumrich wanted to prove that it wasn't a ship. He took Ezekiel's measurements and descriptions and applied them to aerospace engineering. The result was shocking. Blumrich ended up patenting the design of an omnidirectional wheel based on the Bible and wrote a book admitting, Ezekiel saw a spaceship. The design worked. The shape of the legs, the wheels, the propulsion, everything made aerodynamic sense for a lunar lander module. And this brings us to a Hebrew word that changes everything, kavod. In the Bibles we have at home, kavod is translated as the glory of the Lord. It sounds immaterial, spiritual, a divine light. But the Semitic root of the word kavod means weight. It means something heavy, armored, dense. When the glory of the Lord descended upon the tabernacle in the desert, Moses could not enter because the kavod was there. Not because he was spiritually unworthy, but because the radiation or heat of the ship would kill him. The Bible says the kavod made a deafening noise like the roar of many waters or the sound of an army. Clouds don't make the sound of an army. Spiritual light has no physical weight that sinks the ground, but a 50-ton metal ship descending with jet thrusters does exactly that. It shines, it burns, it makes a terrible noise, and it weighs. Ancient texts are filled with these clouds that guide the people. By day, a pillar of cloud, by night, a pillar of fire. Anyone who has seen a SpaceX or NASA rocket launch knows exactly what that is. It is engine exhaust. By day, it looks like white smoke. By night, it glows like fire. Our ancestors weren't following a meteorological miracle. They were following technology they didn't understand. And this technology wasn't just used for transport. It was used for war. When the gods entered their ships, it wasn't for sightseeing. It was to dominate. They had the high ground. They could see everything from above. And if negotiations failed, if humans became too noisy or rebellious, they had the firepower to reset the system. The glory wasn't just a vehicle, it was a weapons platform. And this brings us to the darkest question of all. Why did they use these weapons? Who was fighting whom? The answer lies in a family rivalry that defined the fate of our species. Technology explains the how, but politics explains the why. Why would an advanced civilization destroy its own workforce? Why would the gods bomb the earth they themselves colonized? The answer isn't mystical. It is cold, bureaucratic, and frighteningly human. Sumerian tablets tell us a story of political rivalry that makes Game of Thrones look like child's play. At the center of this conflict were two half-brothers, Enlil and Enki. They were the leaders of the Anunnaki expedition on Earth, but they had opposing views about us. Enki was the scientist, the genetic engineer who, according to texts, perfected the existing primate to create an intelligent workforce. He viewed humanity as his creation, his children. Enlil, on the other hand, was the military commander, the administrator. To him, we were tools, and tools that started to malfunction. The tablets record Enlil's constant complaint. The noise of mankind has become unbearable. I cannot sleep because of their clamor. This is fundamental. In the Bible, they say the flood or the destruction came because man was sinful. But in the original texts of Sumer, the word used isn't sin, it is noise. We were too many. We were noisy. We were reproducing too fast and becoming hard to control. The decision to use the weapon of Brahma or to allow the cataclysm was not a moral judgment. It was pest control. It was a demographic decision. There is an ancient text called the Lament for Ur, which describes what happened when Enlil decided to punish the rebellious cities. It doesn't describe a god snapping his fingers. It describes a toxic cloud. The text says, "The evil wind that carries death." People, terrified, could hardly breathe. The evil wind seized them. It did not grant them another day. Mouths were drenched in blood. Heads rolled. The land was made desolate. This describes radioactive fallout being carried by the wind after a tactical nuclear explosion in the Sinai or the Dead Sea region. The war between Enlil's and Enki's factions wasn't a battle of swords. It was a technological war for control of the planet, and we, humanity, were caught in the crossfire. Some human groups were warned and taken to underground shelters. Think of the underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey, like Derinkuyu, which could house 20,000 people underground with advanced ventilation and massive stone doors that only opened from the inside. Who builds a bunker for 20,000 people in the Stone Age unless they know the surface is about to become uninhabitable? They knew what was coming. The War of the Gods didn't just burn cities, it destabilized the planet. And this leads us to the final piece of the puzzle, the Great Reset that made us forget everything. The nuclear war of 12,000 years ago was not an isolated event. It was the trigger, or perhaps accompanied, a geological cataclysm that modern science calls the Younger Dryas. Earth's climate went mad. Sea levels rose abruptly. Megafauna went extinct. And human civilization, which was at its peak, was reset to square one. This is where researcher Matthew Lacroix points us to the mystery of Göbekli Tepe. This site in Turkey is the oldest temple in the world, with perfectly carved stone pillars erected in a time when supposedly we were just hunter-gatherers. But the strangest thing about Göbekli Tepe isn't how it was built, but how it was abandoned. It wasn't destroyed by invaders. It wasn't buried by an earthquake. It was deliberately, carefully buried by its creators. They spent months covering the temple with tons of sand and earth. Why? The theory is terrifying. They were afraid of the sky. They saw what the weapons of the gods could do. They saw cities turn to glass. Burying the temple was a desperate attempt to create a time capsule, to protect the knowledge carved in the stones against the shockwave, against the fire, or perhaps to hide its location from the Vimanas patrolling the skies looking for targets. Paul Wallace raises a fascinating hypothesis about our current condition. He says humanity suffers from a kind of collective PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We suffered a trauma so great, a destruction so complete, that our collective psyche blocked the memory. We forgot who we are. We forgot we walked with the gods. We forgot we had technology. And we regressed to a state of childhood, inventing comforting myths about angels and demons to explain the flashes of memory of spaceships and atomic explosions that still haunt our unconscious. The history we learn in school is the history of survivors who lost their memory. We look at the pyramids, at Baalbek, at Pumapunku, and we can't understand how they were made because we are looking at the remnants of a golden age that was bombed back into the Stone Age. So when you see the news today, when you see world powers threatening to use nuclear weapons, when you see the Pentagon releasing videos of objects that defy physics, ask yourself, is this new, or are we just completing the cycle? The vitrified sand in the Libyan desert is still there. The radioactive bones of Mohenjo Daro are still there. They are silent witnesses that we have stood on this precipice before. The question isn't if the gods existed. The question is if they come back or if they never left. Will we survive the reset this time? Or will we be once again collateral damage in their war? The truth is hidden in the stones, in the texts, and in your own DNA. It is up to you to remember. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support us and become a member to get exclusive access to audio versions of our material. This helps us a lot. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss any content. See you next time.